Very providential. I remember when I was in junior high, my friends and I found a interesting way to keep ourselves entertained when we were alone. We found a way to pass each other out. And I'm not actually going to tell you how you do that, but I can demonstrate on one of the altar servers after Mass if you really want to know. But I knew something was wrong about it, right? We were keeping it hush-hush, but when I went home one night, and I had this desire to share it with my father. Even though I didn't know really how he'd respond, but when I did, he looked at me a little unlike what the Father probably looked like when he looked at Christ in today's Gospels, more like, "You are my foolish son in whom I'm very displeased," But he just looked at me and was like, "You know that can kill you, right?" I was like, "Oh, no, I didn't know that." And the next time it was offered to me, I kindly declined. Years later, well, not too many years later, my parents divorced. And I thought about that moment, and I thought, what am I going to do now that I don't have my Father's eyes to reflect reality for good and for evil? That was the first time I really felt alone in this world, because I knew I had no one to come home to tell about the struggles that I'm having in the world, to find out from his very eyes what I should be doing and not doing. That's when I thought, well, I have to start making decisions for myself. Every young man needs the eyes of a father to guide him into the world. And this was the same thing for Jesus Christ, the eternal Son of the Father. He too needed to hear the voice of and see the face of his Father saying, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." No male can become a strong man without experiencing that gaze of the Father and that affirmation of the Father. And what's interesting is that every time the Father affirms Christ as his Son, it happens 3 times in the Gospel, it's always associated with Christ's self-giving sacrifice on the cross. The 3 times are at the baptism, which is a prefiguration of Christ's own self-offering on the cross. That's why even after he was baptized, he said, "I have a baptism with which I must be baptized, and how my heart longs for it to be accomplished." And the scripture says he was speaking this in reference to the cross. So the baptism that he was doing here is pointing to his descent into death in order to redeem us. And the Father, looking at his total self-gift for the salvation of others, says, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." Same thing happens at the Transfiguration. It says Moses and Elijah appear to Jesus on the mountain of the Transfiguration. And it says he was speaking to them about the exodus that would take place in Jerusalem. The exodus, it means the Passover. His Passover from life to death and resurrection to free us from sin. And again, the Father speaks forth, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." And the 3rd time happens the very week of his passion, just days before he goes to the cross. He said, "Now my heart is troubled. What should I say? Father, save me from this hour? But it was for this very reason that I came to this hour, that the seed must fall into the ground and die in order to give new life. Father, glorify your name." And then the Father speaks up, "I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again." So every time the Father affirms the Son, it's always connected to him giving his life as a sacrifice for his people. And that's what every man is meant to do. Every male is to become a man means my life is not about me. I offer it in sacrifice for family, for the church, for a greater cause. But you can't get that without a Father. Without a Father looking at you and affirming you in your being. So I want to talk about that book I'm going to be presenting on Thursday. It's an interesting book. It really opened my eyes to a lot of things, called The Boy Crisis. And it was written by a man named Dr. Warren Farrell. And he's actually a political scientist and activist. And he was one of the leading persons on the feminist movement back in the 60s and 70s. He was like the first male feminist. And he even sat on the board for like 5 years consecutively, leading the movement with the women in New York. But over time, he started seeing that with all the good things that were happening with the women's movement, there were some very bad negative effects that were going on in society, where families were beginning to break up in record numbers. And especially boys were following behind on almost every category. And so just as he had been fighting for women's rights, he started to slowly turn his attention to helping out the boys. And the interesting thing that he noted, he said, as soon as I started to do that, I was being ostracized by the very people I was working with before. It's like they didn't want to see the other negative effects of what was going on in our society. But he argues, as men and women, we're all in the same family boat. And when only one sex wins, both sexes lose. So he wrote several books on these different movements, but I want to touch especially on the boy crisis. Why America is producing weak men. I'm only going to give a few points from it today, but we do have a Newman night coming on Thursday, and I'll be really dissecting the whole book with you guys there. And we're going to be having a silent men's retreat from Friday until Sunday, if you can make it. And in that time, we're really going to go into fatherhood. Like, what have been our experiences of fathers in our life? How has that affected us for good and for ill? And kind of just go deeper into this topic. So Dr. Farrell argues, boys are declining in a dramatic way in virtually every key metric in society, whether economics, education, in the workplace, in their mental health, and especially in family. He says, I have discovered that there is a boy crisis, that it is a global crisis, and that is particularly egregious in the United States of America. So I'm going to focus just today on 5 key areas: the family, education system, society, gangs, and virtual reality. So he calls this a fatherless crisis. He says, I discovered that the boy crisis resides where dads do not reside. So with divorce now becoming the new norm, 53% of women in society today do not have a man in the house to help raise their children. 53%, the majority of women in society with children do not have a man to help them in the household. It says boys are falling behind girls in the 63 largest developed nations. As developed nations found solutions to surviving, they allowed more permission for divorce and for children to be raised with minimal or no father involvement whatsoever. We're becoming a dad-deprived nation. So women are no longer dependent so much on the financial needs of men, and that's what's making divorce much easier. And 8 out of 10 times, the children go with the mother when the divorce happens. And so it's becoming a very natural system in which fathers are being separated from their boys. And that's the essence of the problem. Because a boy cannot become a man without the example of the father. Anyone here seen Boys in the Hood? Good for you. Okay, I saw this a long time ago, but the whole beginning of this movie takes place like in the ghetto. This boy's just acting out constantly in the ghetto. It's like in LA in the 1970s or 80s. And his mother at one point drives him to his father's house and says, you have to go live with your father. And he's crying and begging her to let her stay. And she says, I've done everything I can for you, but only your father can raise you to be a man. I need you to go live with him. And it's all about his struggle in trying to survive in those times. A boy must see his father in order to grow up. Even Christ says, no son can do anything except what he sees his father doing. Right? So Christ himself learned to offer himself as a sacrifice by always looking at his Father, who is love, who is total self-gift. And so when he became incarnate, he himself embodies the love of the Father, especially on the cross, to become love, to become a sacrifice. And that's why every time the Father speaks to him, it's in reference to his own total self-gift. You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. You're doing exactly what I always do. Give myself in love. There's also an education crisis. 60% of the students who achieve less than the baseline level of proficiency are now boys. And then we see this in colleges. Colleges are now something 55% female to to male ratio. And that number of males going into the college system is just dropping dramatically every single year. Boys' IQs are dropping, and from kindergarten to college, 75% of the teachers in the education system are female. The difficulty with that is that males and females learn differently. Males are very active. We have a lot of testosterone and a lot of energy we have to get out. And so what we do when we say that males and females learn the same way, well, what do you do with males who are just acting up all the time, goofing off and rigid, right? Well, you give them Ritalin. You give them drugs to sedate them and make them act just more complacent. And so that's why we have such a high diagnosis of these drugs in our times, because we're trying to treat boys in the same way as we treat girls, which we learn very differently. That's why they say, like, when women connect, it's face to face. How do men connect? Shoulder to shoulder. We have to be going in a direction together, just different. Then we have the societal crisis, what he calls. And he points out that there's a new shame that many young boys feel about their own gender. Boys are growing up ashamed to be men. And he says it's a crisis of shame, of boys feeling that their masculinity in itself is toxic, that the future is female, and that dads are but bumbling fools or deadbeats. And so when boys are receiving this narrative, it makes them ashamed of their own being, afraid to become men. And if you think about a lot of TV shows and movies that are coming out, just watch for yourselves. How often do the men seem like bumbling idiots who don't have anything together? And all of a sudden, it's always the mother who has to take care of everything, right? And so the problem is that kids are seeing this all the time. That's the identity that they imbibe. They don't think that they have anything to offer. And the most unattractive thing for a woman, and that I have to hear about more than anything else in confessions with women, is when they're upset, when they feel like they have to carry everything for their husbands. But that's the narrative that's being projected onto us, and boys will take that into themselves. And what it creates is a great shame for their own masculinity. So boys are being taught to associate masculinity itself with toxic or incompetent. And no healthy boy ever wants to be toxic or incompetent. And this is what he leads to, calls the gang crisis. So what do Bloods, Crips, school shooters, and ISIS all have in common? Fatherless homes. That's something I didn't really understand or appreciate before, but especially ISIS. It's all made up, the extremist movements of Mohammedanism is made up of young men coming from homes without fathers, so they go into these gangs that are extremely violent in order to find a sense of identity of their own masculinity. So without fathers in the home, it's very difficult for a young boy to learn what it means to become a man. And if they feel rejected by society, they're afraid to step out, especially if they go to the schools and they're surrounded by girls all the time. Then they'll either retreat from society or they'll look for a different male hierarchy outside of that. And that's why 4.5% times more men commit suicide in their teens than women do, because they just feel checked out of the game. 26 out of 27 of the last school shooters that we have seen all came from fatherless homes. And it was an act of revenge against society itself, feeling like they were not accepted, that they had nothing to offer. Gangs are made up of young men who had no father figures and were only raised by a mother who would take them so far, and then they're so attracted to the false ideals of masculinity that you see in gangs, that then they reject their mother and they go over there. And the ISIS recruits, almost all of them come from fatherless homes. So extremist mentality in itself is usually directed to a lack of fatherhood in the home. And that takes us to the metaverse crisis that is only getting bigger in our times. So men are increasingly checking out of reality. With no father, because a mother's role is to create a very safe home, very compassionate, nurturing home for the children. No one will ever love the child more than the mother. But that's why in every rite of passage, in every culture, it's the man's job to lead the son out. To show him that the world is a dangerous place, but you're stronger than that. And you can compete with that. And you can succeed with that. Right? The movie A Quiet Place is a really good... How many of you have seen Quiet Place? Okay, more than Boys in the Hood. Good for you. So Quiet Place is actually a beautiful scene where the mother in that movie, she says, the boy's afraid because he doesn't want to go to the house because they can get eaten by monsters. And she says, you need to go out of the house with your father because there's going to come a time where I'm not going to be able to take care of you. And if you don't learn from your father how to care for us, then I won't have anyone to depend on when I'm old, and neither will he. And so it's the father's job to lead the child out. With increasing homes with children without fathers there, what are the children doing instead? They're staying in the basement. They're playing video games most of the day, right? So they're projecting all that adventure that they're meant to have onto the TV itself. And that's also the reason there's such a rise in pornography. Because there's nothing more daunting to a young man than the rejection of a woman. But if you feel like you're incompetent, that you can't get a woman's approval, that you're not good enough for that, and if especially you haven't learned to combat with the world, and so earn that favor, that's where pornography comes as a replacement. Dr. Farrell, he says, this is his definition of pornography. Porn is unlimited access to unlimited beautiful women with no danger of rejection at a price they can afford. Unlimited access to unlimited women with no danger of rejection at a price they can afford. So if men are afraid of the world, of feeling rejected by the world, that's where they hide in the basement, living adventure and love virtually on TV rather than in reality. So what is a possible solution? The solution to gender problems can never be asking one sex to step down so the other sex can step up. You don't tell women to become less so that men become more. And neither should we offer boys less so women can become more. And this is what Farrell's whole point is. As men and women, we're all in the same family boat. When only one sex wins, both sexes lose. And this is especially bad for women because women generally date up. And Dr. Farrell, he's actually pretty tough on the boys in this book because he says women don't date losers. They date winners. They date people who they can actually rely on. They don't want to have a father as an extra child to take care of. And so when women don't like to settle. So when men don't raise up, when boys do not become strong, independent, competent leaders, I see a lot of women smiling right now. They're like, I got a good one. So women won't desire them. And what happens is the dating pool for women gets less and less. So if we're in a society where boys are not rising up within their households, within society, then the desire of women for the men that are around them significantly decreased. And that's where you have that inequality there. When only one sex wins, both sexes lose. So some basic solutions to the problem. He says young men need to get involved in other community events with other men. Healthy ways, whether it be sports, camping, exercise, praying together, getting hypothermia together while jumping in rivers, that kind of stuff draws you together. He says parents need to communicate, have communication training to prevent divorces that breed the boy crisis. Schools need more male teachers, vocational education, and recess. And this needs to be a problem that we're actually addressing as a society so that we can curb it. Most of all, what all of us need really points to what's happening today in the gospel and in our mass. All of us as men and women, but especially as men who've grown up without present positive male role models, we need to see the face of our Heavenly Father and hear his voice of affirmation in every one of our lives. And that's exactly why Jesus Christ came to us. And that's why he continues to come to us in every single Mass on this altar, so that every one of us, male and female, through him and with him and in him, can experience the voice of the Father in our own lives. This is my beloved, in whom I am well pleased. Only then can we truly become what we're called to be, a sacrifice laid down for the life of others.